So today, what are we talking about? Conversational design and how to create those conversational experiences. This is kind of a not new, but new part of the industry. It's also almost in the place where UX design was probably a little over a decade ago, where the rules aren't all written. It's like the Wild West. They're the gold rush. There's a lot being built up. There's a lot being tested and a lot in theory, including what it's called, which is why I have two cover slides. So you'll hear conversational design. You'll also hear conversation design. Typically people mean the same thing when they say that, but sometimes it's different. So if that lets you know where we're going, but I put in there it's more than a chatbot because I think that's typically where people's heads go when they first hear conversational design, or they think that I'm doing marketing of some kind, which is fair. So a little bit about me, you've already heard small blurb, so I won't go into too much more detail, but I'm Megan. I now live in Austin, Texas. It was just cool enough to be tolerable outside today, so that was nice. But I was very busy, so I still didn't go outside. I'm a director at UXPA, and as you heard before, I'm leading a group who's designing a lot in the way of like member communications, and it's across the board. A lot of those involve chat and search, but also enterprise tools like documents and e-signature, which is always exciting. So there's a lot there. If it involves communications, even tiny blurbs of on-screen messaging, it typically runs through my team, and they're amazing. And I want to say hi to Cindy, who's from my team, and she's also hanging out in the session today. I do give talks sometimes, not very often, because you're not maybe going to sense it here. I'm incredibly introverted. And so to all my fellow introverts, shout out, you can do it too. Public speaking can be for everyone. We can all do it together. But I do speak every once in a while. Lately, it has been on conversational design, but I've also talked on, accessible experiences, designing for accessible experiences, and larger experience strategies. So all those are like passions to me. And I definitely speak on kind of a variety of those as we go through. Real quick, I don't want to make it awkward, but I see people are waiting to be admitted, but I can't really admit them. If you all can help with that as I go, otherwise I can try. I don't want poor people sitting in the waiting room while I'm talking. So what I did want to ask everyone though, and in the chat, and you'll have to kind of read it off to me because I can't see it, but when I say conversational design, what does that mean to you? Like, how would you define that? What pops in your head as far as conversational design or conversation design? Does it mean anything? Is it just a big question mark?
We have language arrangements coming in. I also think about, a human interaction, or is it a chatbot, right? Like, so what does that look like? The differences there.
Chatbots, yep.
Chatbots coming in, copywriting for transactional interactions coming in, dialogue design, theater, natural language understanding. So some good points in the chat there.
Yep. Here's a few more. You've probably heard at least somebody say, it's this stupid chatbot. I've got it right up on the screen. You won't hurt my feelings. It's totally fair. A lot of folks think that when I say conversational, it's really voice only or voice focused, or about speech recognition. Also those lovely phone trees when you call in, like press 1 to go to this menu. And if you know this key, like dial that in. Congratulations. Or if you've ever interacted with a virtual assistant or a chatbot before, I think we heard something where it didn't understand. You've probably gotten a lot of, I didn't catch that. I'm still learning. I don't know what I'm doing. So those are all not the best examples, but I think those tend to be the ones that are top of mind when we talk about conversational design. And that's a big part of what I'm trying to do is make those experiences better. So we don't hear, dumb chatbot. Oh, I hate the phone tree. I hate pushing stuff. I just say representative and push 0 to make it end. So to like move away from those painful experiences. So let's see how other people define that though, because again, it's kind of new and it's a little amorphous. So there's a lot going on there with even how larger companies define and represent conversational design. So for Google, they refer to it as a design language. So based on human conversation, you'll see that as a common theme of the element of human and language or human conversation, but everything else can be completely different. Erica Hall, if you're familiar with her, she actually wrote the book Just Enough Research, which isn't technically related, but it's still a very good book and you should get it. She also wrote a book on conversational design, and it's a nice like philosophical and entry approach to conversational as an industry and a concept. And she refers to it as such, as a concept about looking at human conversation for digital systems, for building in those interactions. And, you know, just some random, probably some folks at USAA sat around and worked very hard to define their own version of that, where it's a design discipline in the organization where we model human conversation to create natural digital experiences. So they all seem very similar, and they're all very, very different at the same time. So for us, it's more of a design discipline. We see it as overarching. For Erica Hall, it's a concept. And for Google, it's a design system. So like componentized and building blocks. And really all of those mean essentially the same thing. So we've got a Venn diagram because it can't be a design presentation without one. But really, when conversational design is a combination of these three pillars, using human language, pairing it with human psychology, and also mixing that with technology. So you're having your human interaction and your human factors, which should sound very familiar. But then we're also pulling in, yes, natural language processing and natural language understanding, and many more acronyms that are tied into more of an AI type system. So all of those pieces make up conversational design. So if the question is it a chatbot? Is it a virtual assistant? Is it search? Is it, you know, a voice line? Yes, it can be all of those things, especially if it's tied into a natural language understanding system, so that type of technology. But how does that fit into kind of this larger picture of our system? We know, you know, UI, that's kind of where we started. And then there's user experience, and then there's customer experience, and then there's conversational experience design. So outside of most of them having X's and all kind of being initials here, it's how do these all fit together? Because conversational design may feel far away. Like that may feel like something that's not really related to the rest of our industry. Luckily, I'm here to let you all know it's totally part of where we are. And if you are a designer, this is not going to be as foreign as you think. Let's just say that. And if you're a designer and also someone that works with content and structures and maybe information architecture, it will even feel a little bit more close to where you are. So, and we do know this, it's roughly every 15 to 20 years, there's kind of a platform shift in the digital space. And the conversation design is just another platform shift in that digital space. So it's not really necessarily all these separate things. It's one is built off of the other. So we've started with interface design. Remember, like the original, like the first time there was kind of a UI, we weren't even thinking about it. The navigation would run away from you, you know, GeoCities, like very old, classic, like internet days that maybe we long forward to a bit. But that's where we started forming these fundamental design principles of like, well, maybe we shouldn't have websites be so weird that they're totally unusable. And then there was a shift. And I think everyone here is hopefully old enough to remember like the shift into mobile. I certainly am. I'm pre this. And that really started dipping into what we refer to as user experience. And we started bringing the psychology behind it. And the real estate changed. So mobile, there was more flexibility and there were gestures and touch. So it was more open in that way. But it was also a much smaller screen. You'd hear people saying, you know, content first or content screen or content first on the screen or, you know, mobile first. So moving away from maybe a standard locked in desktop perspective and understanding that actually it's multi-device and multi-gesture. And so building on top of that with technology, the way it's been moving with artificial intelligence assistance, we're now seeing conversational design kind of emerge as another part of that practice. And it's got a lot of linguistics behind it. The words are the actual interface a lot of the time, which means that a lot of the boundaries are also completely gone. And that's a good thing and a bad thing to not have boundaries on some of these things. And it's involving not just, a visual interface at times, but also the natural language interface. I'm going to pause for a second because I like when people ask questions and I hate just talking. So when has somebody run into a good conversational experience? Has that ever happened to anyone? Using Amazon chat or something else? It could be a call-in, a voice. Have you ever run into experience that was kind of what you refer to as pleasant? I can definitely take awkward silence, so I can sit here as long as it takes to get an answer.
We got Maggie coming in with my local coffee shop. And is that based here in Kansas City or is that in another city?
Ah, Toronto. Hard to recall when it was pleasant. Yes, that's fair. That's a big part of, it's a baby industry a little bit. So we're kind of in like those awkward growing up years. But, it's definitely getting big very fast. It's almost kind of scary how quickly things are growing and how little we have in the way of kind of that unified direction. Again, when you think about UX back in the day, when they were first defining things like design thinking and the rules around heuristics and proper design guidelines, again, it was like the Wild West, and it's very similar to what this is, but it's emerging everywhere and everyone's trying to build what a good experience is, or these are the guidelines for a good experience. And we don't quite have all of it figured out yet. But it is something that is rapidly expanding. There's a lot of value in it outside of just cutting out people, which isn't, I will say, is not the main intention of any of these experiences. But it is seen as a huge value add. So I've got great little fact here. Digital voice assistants are going to triple by 2023. I'm sure you've seen other ones that are by 2025, everything will double. It's expanding quite rapidly. And the technology is actually moving faster than we can handle at times. But it's definitely causing kind of a fervor across businesses because they're trying to figure out like how do we add value with this? Like, is it just add a chatbot? Can I just throw this in here and hope that it works? And no, that's not the case. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But you'll see that if you're, I assume in your companies as well, you've probably heard a little bit about that. Like, oh, we have a chat, or we'll put an agent up, or we'll, move people off the phone lines and have them fill out this thing, or, we can just tack it onto the app or something. And they're not quite sure where to go or really where to start with that, because there are quite a few foundations to conversation design. But the end idea is competitors are really moving from the space of conversing, so basic conversations, more so into active engaging. It's not necessarily enough at this point to just even converse with somebody. That can be done in content and a lot of other ways. It's really about this active engaging of the audience. And through that, there's kind of a couple, I tried to pull out some, there's really quite a few, but these are kind of the standouts, we'll call them verticals, that folks are really putting a lot of investment in. And perhaps your companies as well, or perhaps they should. One of those is moving from this concept of an intelligent search to a transactional search. And while that sounds like really fancy, what it means is, let's say, Google is an intelligent search. It's compiling a lot of information, learning like your intent of the information you're looking for and feeding that back. Transactional is when you're actually taking on an activity within the search. So in my case, I work in the banking and insurance industry. So if someone's using our search and they're actually asking to update a policy, feeding that in through the search, they're not actually having to leave that window. Now that's processed through a natural language understanding system, at least on our side. So that's a big one we're personally investing in, but there's more to that. It's tailoring communication. A lot of people say personalization. There is a fine line there with what's too much personalization, what hits an uncanny valley or kind of violates people's space. And definitely a lot of investment, a lot of dollars, more than I can probably comprehend, being put into creating multimodal. And what multimodal is being able to move back and forth between experiences. So if somebody is on an app, being able to move to their computer, or if they've called in, getting a text message and jumping to the app, so they're able to be functional across a variety of platforms, also pulling in a variety of information. So say you're in chat, it's feeding in a weather report because you've asked a question about it or something. So it's this multimodal, multi-channel, and also multi-bot, because there really isn't a lot of systems set up where one bot or one system can do it all. And it actually tends to be a little bit easier to have a collection of them, even some external and third-party ones like Apple Business Chat, setting up through there. So it's creating this ecosystem around the customer and putting investment in building that way, and not necessarily building up every single channel, but building them up a variety of channels in the right way. So you're not giving everybody everything, understanding what user tasks are, and then adding those to each individual channels. So it feels like a system for folks. So we talked about language, and we all speak language and we know the words. So how hard can this possibly be? How difficult is it to create conversational interfaces? We talk all the time. I don't know if anybody's seen like what business writing looks like, but if you are a copywriter, I hope that maybe you're wincing a little bit at what you've had to go through, and I will let you know that I feel your pain. But language is something that is very intrinsic to us. It's instinctive. We're hearing words before we're born. Language is so powerful that babies from different countries have different cries. So there's different inflection there from the language they're hearing. It's also naturally social. It worked for us back in the day, a few hundreds of thousands of years ago to survive, but it still carries that purpose of social interaction. And it also includes things like inflection and gestures and nonverbal cues. So it's like a whole system that's built in that we learn, before birth. It also builds on context and culture, which is a lot of times why, a joke over here doesn't necessarily translate into different areas or to different languages, because there's different culture and there's different context. There's also different figures of speech that go along with that. And there's a lot of ways that all of this builds up together, which makes it very complex at times. Language can be very subtle, and it can also tap an unlimited number of topics in an unlimited number of ways. If you think people and how they speak and how they refer to things, well, we might have general patterns. You could broach almost any topic any way you want and still figure out with another human being what each other are trying to say. A system doesn't necessarily have that practice, and our technology is not there yet to be able to take on all these nuances and pieces that make up how we communicate to each other. So, where do you start then? You start by adding to your conversational foundation. So there's kind of three pieces to the foundation of creating conversational experiences. And one of them is the Cooperative Principle, developed by Paul Grice. And he's also created these lovely maxims. I've included them as well. But this is a starting point for the rules of conversation. So when he created these, it was really more for verbal conversation between individuals, obviously trying to reach the same goal, which is understanding between each party. And we're translating that into the digital space with systems. So knowing these maxims, and if you're, the maximum quality, being sure that you're truthful, or at least you know what you're speaking to and there's evidence behind it. Originally, there were the four. So it was quantity, quality, manner, and relation. Those were created by Paul Grice. Politeness was added later. It's still a topic of debate if we need a politeness, but I do like the addition that politeness specifies maximizing the cost and benefit for somebody. And internally, we say, make the user feel good, or in our case, make the member feel good, because our users are called our membership. So we do use that as a point of emphasis, but these are this is point one of that foundation to conversational. The second one is really, and by the way, I had no idea, Chris Messina. So I actually know him from, not personally, but from conversational commerce. He actually wrote on conversational commerce and then followed up with some articles saying he was actually completely wrong about everything in conversational commerce. But what's interesting is that he actually invented the hashtag, which is maybe how other people know him. I actually know him from the reverse. But the other second fundamental of conversational design is turn taking. So it's this handing over and taking back. And we do it, you know, between people and make those turns clear. You can understand that by just a simple pause between individuals. So we need to train our systems and build our systems up to make it clear when the user should take over the conversation. And we call those prompts. And a prompt can be easy as a question. It typically is set up that way, or some kind of direction to encourage the person to say something back or make a decision. Sometimes it's a follow-up. If it's a voice and we didn't quite hear them, we say, I didn't get that. Did you still want to do this? So it's setting up that turn taking. And because machines can't pick up on all the cues we have to know when it's our turn to talk, we have to be very explicit about how we build that. So how we share those turns. And the third one is building for human context, which if you are on UX, it's the exact same thing. So it's understanding the person behind the experience you're building. It's not any more or less complex. You're still having to consider things like where they are, especially with voice and how the voice systems can't always understand someone. So if they're in a busy environment, that has to be taken into consideration. Or maybe they're in a place where they don't want their conversation to be visible. Maybe they don't have any patients that day. Maybe they're very stressed out, so they need the system to move faster than it normally would. Maybe they actually speak a completely different language and we're not prepared to handle that. Or maybe they just speak with an accent. And again, the system hasn't been appropriately set up to be able to understand those people. So we have to kind of take all those into account. Just like for a visual, interactive, or mobile experience, same thing for a conversational experience. Just always consider the role of the people behind the system when building these out. And it's especially important for conversational because you really need to speak, and I talk about this a little bit later, but you really need to speak in the language of the people interacting with you. If you're not speaking in their language, it's very hard to design a successful conversation. You can guess, but you're really looking to build that relationship. So you've got this human brain and it's interacting with an artificial brain. And the human brain, this is what I say. And the system reads that and says, this is what I hear. But there's a deeper level to that where, you know, the human that is interacting with the system has a meaning behind that. There's an intent. This is what I mean. And that's really what we have to figure out so the system understands. And while the human component needs things like, you know, empathy and helpfulness and kind of being moved along and making the conversation feel like it's you know, easy and it's making good progress. The artificial brain or the system that makes up the bot needs things like intents. You need to understand what your goal is. It needs things like entities. So those are pieces of data that's like a time or a size of a pizza. So we need to understand that to actually solve that user's problem or need appropriately. We also need to know context. There's additional levels of information that need to be pulled in. Again, availability, time of day, those are all very important. And all kinds of other variables, depending on how complex the system is or how many other systems it has to tie into. So each brain needs a certain amount of information and a certain amount of context to help the other one be successful and feel understood. So I'm going to pause again, just for a moment. But does anybody have any questions while we're running through or insights? Anything standing out?
I'm going to let the chat go here, Megan, while we're seeing if there's any questions. But wow, those principles were very important and just it was awesome to hear. You know, just hearing a little bit more about Maximum's principles and things like that. Just really excited to expand upon this after this talk. So thank you. We've got interesting to hear about what the robot needs versus the human needs. I would agree with that, Tom. So that's a good one there. And then we have Lisa that says, I love Notion turn taking, and that makes me think of turn sharing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and linguists have a, you don't have to get too deep in this to be successful, but it's interesting how linguists explain the idea of taking a turn and giving a turn in speech, and how much happens behind the scenes that we don't even think about for that. But we do have to think about it when we create these interfaces. So you're probably wondering, like, that's a lot. How do I actually get started if I have these foundations? I think a big one is you understanding and everyone understanding that AI isn't magic. You don't just kind of throw some info in, it's like a black box and it just generates an entire conversation and the whole system works. There's really, again, just like user experience, we have to do research and understand the system. You also have to understand the technology and its limitations. We're not that advanced just yet. A lot of people are talking like it is, but we're still on a very basic level as far as conversational AI goes. And that's even for companies like IBM and Amazon and Google. Google probably a little bit further along. I don't know if anybody checked out their Lambda from Google I/O. Their Lambda system was very interesting, actually. But the way to start dipping into this is to not sketch, which feels very counter. But when you think about it, the interface isn't the interface, the words are the interface. And you can build a conversation just like you would assemble components together. You don't necessarily have to have a very rich copywriting background to start building out conversational experiences. Think of them as the words as functional components. Because at the end of the day, the user is trying to understand what you're saying so they can be successful. And the whole idea is to work cooperatively and drive them towards their end goal. Some of that's feeding them information. Some of it could be just linking them to somewhere. But think of it that way as an interactive path. So to start, you really start with the conversation. Before you sketch, before you flow, determine the needs on both sides. So you actually have two players here. You have your person. So when we do empathy mapping exercises, you're kind of building out the world for that human person. You actually need to do the same for your automated individual, your bot, because they also have information and needs, and there's things that they can and cannot do. Now, they might not think I'm sad about this, but they do have pieces of information and slots that have to be filled in order to actually help that human component. So look at those two together and actually figure out the requirements for both of them, and then create that conversation and write it out. Almost like play acting, you can do table reads, but the words are the interface, which means you work on the script first and act it out. You can then start sketching flows and figuring out the structure of the conversation beyond that. But the second you start dropping that conversation into a screen, it tends to lock it down. And we're talking about something, an interface that's very fluid, and you don't want to lock it down right away. You need to figure out the right flow to the conversation, which means start with the words. Don't start with the patterns of the screens, of the interaction of the screens, or even the flow if it's a voice skill. Don't start there. Start with the words. And imagine each time you're writing this that there isn't actually an interface behind it. So what if I couldn't see anything? So how would I navigate this? What would these turns look like? How would I make things obvious for the user to pick up and be able to keep going? And it's always good, there's a ton of free text-to-speech engines online. You can also pay for a few, but hear it. Again, even if it's in text, hearing the conversation makes it easier to determine if something doesn't sound quite right. You can also do what we call Wizard of Oz testing, where you can set up kind of pre-prepped answers from the machine, or drop those into the text-to-speech engine, and just sit down with somebody else and interact and play back and forth. So someone pretends to be the user, and they'll speak to you and answer you, and then you use the system's automated responses that you've created. And you'll start to find out real fast if that conversation actually works. Because I guarantee you, people are going to say things that you never would have expected. So it's kind of like the easiest way to figure out how to broach that. So that's kind of the design portion, but there's this big overarching kind of shadow that is the technology portion. And this is probably the toughest sell-in, because conversation, when done right, takes a lot of investment in the tech. Even if you're working with a third party, it just really is. It's a system that has to lift a lot and process a lot. And it needs a lot of actually human investment up front to even start setting it up. So it's not a one and done. Like I said, it's not magic. You don't just drop stuff in the box. There has to be constant and continual analysis. There have to be people training the AI. We've seen what happens when we don't train an AI. It actually, it can leave people out. It can unintentionally, judge people for unreasonable reasons. Like we've, there's been examples on Twitter and other places where we've seen that gone awry, from AI powered apps that can't see certain people's skin color to cars that, self-driving cars that can't see certain folks. And it's like, that's because the bias was accidentally built in by not considering, how humans need to monitor that system and make sure it's not doing those things. So typically, as far as technology goes, we've got kind of like these 5 layers, these 5 steps. And I will say right now, no one is at number 5. No one. It does not exist right now. That's obviously the end goal, but it does not exist right now. Most companies, most technology is at level 1 or 2. So you have kind of a form bot where it might just be an automatic, like you click a button and it just advances you. That's what that's like. Or a basic bot where it's listening for keywords. So it's almost like a search in a chat form. And it's really just more information retrieval. I'll pull a link. I need to hear those magic keywords. So the issue here is that, from steps 1 to probably 3, you put a lot of burden on the human to figure out how to use the system. But as you move up those steps, it gets easier. They're not having to guess how everything works. They're not having to be like perfect in their enunciation and perfect in the words that they're choosing, the language they're choosing to be successful. When you start getting to level 3, that's where it kind of opens up. Again, this is also where you start needing to use an AI to process, because there's only so much you can hard code in for this stuff. So you need something additional to process it. But when you start getting there, it starts releasing that burden on the user. And, they still have to kind of know what they want, but they don't have to do it in the precise way in order to be successful. So there's less chance of like breaking or getting that, I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you said, and I probably never will. The most advanced systems right now are kind of in that consultative, so that level 4, they're able to process things more deeply. And they can allow people to speak in their own words. So a full sentence, I want to schedule a trip to Sydney next week. So that full, and I'm very busy, understanding that, and then getting the context and knowing this person wants to schedule a trip and being able to process that, instead of having to piecemeal all those words out and saying, book trip to Sydney and then picking the date, that kind of thing. And what that looks like when you start advancing that technology, it changes the scope of the experience. So we move from this very shallow, again, like FAQ information, to a fully anticipatory system where it's actually reaching out when it's appropriate, beyond being proactive, but actually reaching out and being able to adapt on the fly. So to the different context that's actively changing during the conversation. And that's quite a ways off. But really, the plus to kind of the scope is moving into that transactional space. That's where people find a lot of use in conversational experiences, when they can do simple tasks there, not necessarily information retrieval. Like, it's fine. I think a lot of folks understand that bots are primarily used for information retrieval, but a lot of the value is really stepping it up and pulling it into that transactional space. There is an expectation that it's really just for simple tasks. If things get too complex, there is a line, and you'd have to do research to figure out, varying on your particular company or your area, what that line is for folks. They are going to want to talk to a human being, and then that handoff should be seamless. But they are, as far as simple tasks go, people do want those. And it's something that they believe they should have in kind of, again, this ecosystem of devices as well. So it's not necessarily like present in app and that's it. The expectation is that they actually will have different transactional abilities and different experiences, from Apple Watch to Facebook chat and all of those. And kind of the final piece, we've got technology and kind of where to go with it and what to do with it, is building that team. Now, these are kind of like the three main roles, but you'll see these kind of mixed together or traded, or maybe called something different. You'll see like VUI designer, but essentially the conversational designer sets the strategy and the approach. So when we talk about flows, how things are supposed to interact, that's really the role of the conversational designer. And that's the one that is connected most closely to UX designers today. It's kind of a natural movement into that space. You'd essentially be setting the interaction patterns and the flow and what the other overall experience should be up front. And then the conversational copywriter takes over, and they're really refining all the language. At some point, you do need someone with that level of expertise, be they a copywriter or a linguist, to come in and make sure you're matching tone and brand and everything's very aligned and also easily understood. So your copywriter comes in and refines and creates all those different conversations. And then you have your AI trainer. Like I said, it's not a black box. You need human beings to make sure the system's actually being matured in the right way and it's actually functional. So they'll do things like set up phrases that the copywriter has created as test phrases and see how it processes and actively track and help build up the system on their end. So these, again, there's a lot of like variation here. Our titles are all over the place, very reminiscent of design in general, I would say. You'll see a variety, but these are kind of the three main roles that make up a system when you're talking about, hey, I want to build a conversational design department in my company. This is what you'd kind of look for. And just as a reminder, it's easy to get bogged down with the technology because it's so big and to think it's very technology focused. But the idea is that at the end of the day, you're training the machine to understand the human, not the other way around. We already do that where we force the human to figure out the system, and we want to flip that and have the system be able to figure out the human so they can be more successful. And that's Kathy Pearl from Google. She's done a crazy amount of talks, super intelligent lady. I would definitely check her out. So this concludes my presentation. I did see there were maybe a couple more questions, but I would love to have an open discussion.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Megan, for just introducing us a little bit more to conversational design and just kind of taking us through the principles and finishing out there, kind of bringing that team together. I did have a question in the chat from Maggie. I'll go ahead and start off there. Maggie says, I'm curious to learn how chatbots manage context and in particular code switching when chatters change context speech patterns. So I'll let you take that one there.
Yeah, so on a basic level, we start with intent. So the intent is what the goal is behind whatever you're uttering or whatever you're typing in. And what you're talking about is the ability to handle multiple intents. So it's kind of that next step up. Right now, they don't manage it very well. But again, this is where you need that AI, because you need the system to be able to basically remove that slot and pull another slot in, but also remember the context. So let's say I'm ordering ice cream and I've started with a cone and then I go, but I also want a sundae. So we've like moved in a different slot. So we'll process the order for the sundae and then say, by the way, let's bring your ice cream cone order back. So that's how the system would do it, but that is insanely hard at this point in time. So don't let anybody make it sound like it's super easy, but it is referred to as handling multiple intents.
Great, thank you. Go ahead and, if you want, go ahead and put your questions in the chat. Lisa, I know that you're keeping a pulse on the chat as well. Did you see any questions come through? And if not, feel free to raise your hand or unmute your mic and we can get you there as well.
Nothing else, Tyler, I'm calling you out. How did I do?
Yeah, there is a comment from Tyler, actually, right. Tyler's comment there. Let's see. A lot of these conversational fundamentals remind me of the basic communication theory, Shannon Weaver, Berlow, Donahue, models of communication.
Yeah, a lot of these they'll sound very similar depending on which industry you're from. So if you're more communication focusing, more copywriting, you'll see some connections here of like, yes, this is typically how we go through this with, another like content pattern. And if you're on the UX side, you should see something similar. It's definitely, the gap is not as wide as you think. I mean, I obviously crossed the bridge from user experience design into conversational design. You don't have to be an expert right off the bat. You can actually look into it. There's a ton of courses, really good information. I would recommend checking out Bot Society. I would recommend checking out the Conversation Design Institute. I would recommend checking out Voxable, which is a smaller company. They specifically work in voice. And obviously Google has like an entire training section, but it's definitely not that far off. And it's really where at least part of our industry is moving. So if nothing else, it's good to understand the context of what this is and how it works for you, especially if you work primarily in the mobile space. I would say it's very critical to kind of think of that, because it's something that right now, unfortunately, is just kind of tacked on to a website or a mobile app. We like throw a chat at it, just throw a chat at it, it'll fix it. So knowing a little bit about what that can do and what it should be is really going to help you make that overall experience better, even if you're not creating the bot yourself.
And I went ahead and plugged in the Bot Society there, but we also have a couple of things. Tyler did follow up with saying you did great, so just some confirmation there on that. Dan Jones comes in and says it was interesting to see you mention nonverbal cues as part of the communication. It got me to thinking, what examples are there of nonverbal cues in conversational design?
Typically pause. Typically a pause or a break. And that's hard to gauge. Still, things like sentiment or even levels of frustration are hard to gauge at this point in time. But in these scenarios, nonverbal would really be a pause. So if you're on a voice interaction, if let's say you're using Alexa to order a pizza, I always do food. You can tell I'm a little hungry right now. But Alexa's asking you, what size pizza you want. And let's say you turn and walk out the room because you need to ask your spouse, I don't know what size pizza we need. I have no idea. So you've walked away and Alexa's kind of hanging out, and it has a counter. So you'll see this in the system. There'll usually be a counter of milliseconds or seconds. It'll wait and then say, hey, did you still want to order pizza? Or, hey, what size? It'll reprompt. So, hey, what size did you want? So that's really the nonverbal cue. I mean, the way you can see how animated I am when I talk, there's a lot more nonverbal going on there. Our systems can't detect that yet. The holy grail of detection is really sarcasm. Someday maybe we'll get sarcasm, but right now we're not quite there yet. But yeah, the same thing in text. If somebody has like left a chat for whatever reason, if they've closed it out, building in that timer. So, okay, there's been a pause. So something's going on, I need to recheck or I need to reprompt as a nonverbal cue.
No, and that makes me think of, when you said sarcasm, I had seen a post of somebody had put with the chatbot saying, did you come here for Star Wars Day? Just kind of kicking off the interaction rather, what's Star Wars Day? So, but Tyler came in and said, aside from privacy concerns with user data, are there big picture ethical concerns that people are talking about for conversation?
That's probably a whole other talk, but yes. So there's things like I talked about bias, accidentally building in bias is a big thing. But others are just like flat out not understanding people. If you don't have, right now the system is set up, if you are not speaking in the most, especially for voice platforms, but these most perfect version of like I want to say Nebraskan because I feel like they have no accent there. So like Nebraskan English, it's a small, narrow space of language that we're actually able to fully understand. And that's a limitation of technology being built up, but that's an ethical concern, is that we're leaving people out of the picture because the system's just been set up to understand somebody who speaks perfectly in this defined perfect way. There's other things with just data in general and what we're collecting. We actually have an ethics standard. All the good companies should, if you start processing things, data in general, but especially so with artificial intelligence, you need to set ethical standards with what data you're pulling in and what you're doing with it and how long you can keep it. There are laws around, like the UK has specific ones about data and how you're allowed to save it. California has something as well, but really you should be making the effort anyway, because there is a trust thing there. It's like, I don't know what you're doing with this, and to a certain degree, the technology is still floaty enough that you don't want it to be sketchy. You don't want to pull more information than you need. And you definitely want to make sure people feel in control of that interaction. But yeah, all kinds of, like, there's more than that. It's just, yes, it's like I think I read not too long ago that somebody was trying to set up laws to like stop all work on artificial intelligence because we're just doing all kinds of things with it. And it's almost becoming like the genetics work we're doing in science. Someone's like, no, what are you doing? You're going too far. Like, you're, you know, it could go all kinds of ways. So there are a lot of big concerns. And luckily, you know, most people are on the path that we are, where it's you have to think about it ahead of time and plan for it ahead of time. It's not going to be perfect, but you have to build in those standards before you start letting the AI just fly off on its own and go crazy.
So I think, no, thank you so much. I think I'll wrap up with a couple of, first, a great thought and by Alan that says, I wonder how much facial recognition type design will come into play, recognizing changes in facial expression, etc. And then to finish off, one last question, and then we'll kind of begin to close here. But do you see a future where conversation experience design includes more and more face-to-face human to bot video conversations?
Things are unclear if it'll really catch on. I do know that people are kind of playing around in that space, and it could be interesting. It kind of ties into augmented reality and a few other things. I don't think at this point we really know. The industry, again, we're kind of baby still. So it could go in a lot of places. Like, at the end of the day, adoption's kind of funny that way. And sometimes people will be all about it, and other times they're like, nope, line too far, uncomfortable. That's not what I want in my life. So, who knows? I don't have a good answer for that one, but yeah, it's always a possibility.